In 2018, Destiny 2 was 5 weeks away from being shut down. Not scaled back, completely shut off entirely. Bungie has even admitted this. However, it survived, and then it ran for 8 more years. Long enough to divorce the biggest publisher in the industry, give itself away for free, delete years of its own content just to stay alive, and sell to Sony for $3.6 billion. But in the end, none of that even mattered, because after 9 years, Bungie officially switched off the content engine for good. But here's what almost nobody noticed. Every one of those disasters, the deleted content, the broken expansions, the layoffs, and even the shutdown itself, traces back to a single decision made before the game even launched. One choice, buried in a publishing contract from 2010 that doomed Destiny 2 from day one. And once you see it, the downfall of Destiny 2 makes so much more sense. This is the entire development cycle of Destiny 2, from concept to shutdown. And the real question isn't how it died, it's how it survived this long at all. By 2016, Destiny had become a strange kind of success. The original game launched in 2014 to a rough reception, but Bungie spent the next 2 years patching, expanding, and rebuilding it. And by the time the 2015 expansion, The Taken King, arrived, Destiny was finally starting to become great. Millions of people were hooked, and by external measures, things were going pretty well for Destiny. Under the hood, though, Destiny was a complete nightmare to work on. The game had been built on an engine and a set of development tools that were famously brutally slow. Bungie developers later described a pipeline so clunky that even small changes could take an absurd amount of time. And Destiny's troubled creation, which included a near-total story rewrite late in development, had left it carrying years of technical debt. On top of that, the game still ran on the previous console generation, the PS3 and Xbox 360s, alongside the new machines, which dragged performance down and capped what Bungie could possibly build. That's the first reason Destiny 2 exists. A sequel was a chance to drop the old hardware, rebuild the engine and the tools, and finally put Destiny on something that could keep up. It was also the perfect chance to bring the franchise to PC for the very first time. The second reason was the publishing deal they had with Activision. Back in 2010, Bungie had signed a roughly 10-year publishing agreement with Activision, reportedly worth around $500 million. And that deal was built around a very specific model. Destiny was never meant to be one endless game. It was meant to be a series of games. A release, a few expansions, then a full sequel on repeat. Activision wanted Destiny to behave like Call of Duty, a big new entry on a predictable schedule. Under that model, Destiny 2 wasn't really an open question, it was always coming. And the third reason was the players. By 2016, Destiny 1 had become almost impossible for a newcomer to walk into. Years of expansions, currencies, light level systems, and stacked up mechanics had built a wall that veterans loved and new players bounced straight off of, which granted is still a problem in Destiny 2, and I don't think they're ever going to be able to fix it. Needless to say, Bungie wanted a fresh start for new players, so Destiny 2 made one of the most controversial calls in the franchise's life before it even shipped. It completely reset everybody. Your Destiny 1 inventory would not carry over to Destiny 2, and the pitch was a level playing field where a brand new player and a 4-year veteran could start the sequel at the same time. And then there was the story. Destiny 1's narrative, gutted in that late rewrite, had left a campaign that barely held together. Destiny 2 was the chance to do it right, a proper campaign with a real beginning, middle, and end. And that campaign would become the Red War. So put it all together and the answer to why make Destiny 2 is pretty clear. A fresh engine, a fresh platform, and a new start for players with a new story, all wrapped inside a publishing deal that wanted a sequel regardless. But buried in all of that was a tension that haunts the rest of the entire story. Bungie's real dream was never a string of numbered sequels. The studio wanted one single, evolving world. Bungie wasn't the only one chasing a number, by the way. I'm trying to hit 100,000 subscribers in 1 year. If this kind of deep dive is your thing, please hit the subscribe button. Destiny 2 was in part a compromise with a publisher who wanted things done another way. And the game that came out of that compromise was built as Chapter 1 in a planned series. It was never designed to run for 9 years. Remember that, because almost every disaster in this story traces back to one fact. Destiny 2 became a forever game it was never built to be. Destiny 2 launched on September 6, 2017, and for about 3 weeks, the plan looked like it had worked. The campaign, The Red War, finally gave Destiny one thing the original never really had: a clear, dramatic, self-contained story. It had a beginning, middle, and an end, and more importantly, millions of players bought in. In October, the game came to PC for the very first time and pulled in a whole new audience, and on paper, the fresh start was a triumph. And then, the same thing that hollowed out Destiny 1 came for the sequel. There was nothing to do after beating the campaign. The endgame ran dry almost immediately, and a lot of the systems that kept hardcore players chasing gear in Destiny 1 had been simplified or stripped away. And the most dedicated players, the ones who logged hundreds of hours, burned through everything in weeks, that grind that was supposed to keep them online just wasn't there. Then of course, there was Eververse. Destiny 2 had an in-game store called Eververse where you could spend real money on loot boxes called Bright Engrams, or earn them slowly by playing and leveling up. In November 2017, players figured out something Bungie had never told them. The game was secretly throttling the experience points you earned. The more efficiently you played, the less XP the game actually credited you. Even as the screen showed you the full amount, the game was quietly slowing your progress toward the same rewards you could pay real money to skip. Bungie admitted the system existed and switched it off. Then it doubled the amount of XP needed to earn a Bright Engram in the first place, which somehow made it feel worse. Game director Luke Smith and project lead Mark Noseworthy canceled a live stream to publicly address the state of the game. The trust the fresh start was supposed to build was draining fast. That's the climate the first expansion walked into. Curse of Osiris launched on December 5th, 2017, and it stumbled into two directions at once. First, it was thin. A small new area on Mercury and a campaign you could finish in an afternoon. Nowhere near enough to justify the price. Second, and far worse, buying it changed the rest of your game. Curse of Osiris raised the power cap, which quietly raised the level requirements on existing high-end activities. So players who didn't buy the DLC suddenly found themselves locked out of content they already owned, including the Prestige Raid and Prestige Nightfall activities. Players had paid $60 for Destiny 2, and now pieces of it were walled off behind a $35 pass. It felt less like an optional expansion and more like a subscription fee. Bungie publicly called its own handling of it a mistake and patched the lockouts, but the damage was already done. The second expansion, Warmind, arrived in May 2018 and it was better. It added Mars, brought back the Warmind AI Rasputin, and introduced a tougher cooperative activity for the dedicated crowd. But better wasn't the same as enough. The player base kept sliding and the mood around the game stayed sour, and here's how close it actually came. Bungie has since admitted that around this stretch, the studio was, in its own words, roughly 5 weeks away from shutting Destiny 2 down as a product. Not scaling it back, shutting it off completely. The 10-year game, the fresh start that was supposed to fix everything, was barely 8 months old and had already started staring at the end of the road, which makes what happened in year 2 one of the greatest comebacks in live service history. Forsaken was greenlit as a rescue operation, and the team's first big decision tells you they understood the stakes. Open the expansion by killing the franchise's most beloved character. Cade 6, voiced by Nathan Fillion, dies in Forsaken's first mission, shot with his own gun, and Bungie revealed the death months before launch, and built the entire marketing campaign on the funeral. Destiny has spent 4 years as a universe where nothing was ever truly at stake, and the developers' stated logic was that players wouldn't believe the game had changed unless the change cost them something they loved. The year of winning back trust starts with the death of Cayde 6. The second decision was a philosophical reversal. Destiny 2 had launched streamlined and predictable because Bungie was chasing a broader, casual audience. Forsaken was built for the opposite player. Random weapon rolls came back, the grind got longer and deeper on purpose. The Dreaming City, the new endgame destination, was a slow burn puzzle box with a 3-week curse cycle and secrets that took the community months to crack. Luke Smith's team was openly designing for hobbyists again, the people who treated Destiny as a second job. Pulling that off in 12 months took more hands than Bungie had. And here's the part that the Bungie good, Activision bad narrative skips. Forsaken was built partially by Activision. High Moon Studios and Vicarious Visions, the publisher's support teams, carried a real share of production load. The same way High Moon had let Warmind months earlier, the partnership everyone assumed Bungie resented was, at the assembly level, the thing that was keeping the schedule alive. And it worked creatively. Forsaken launched on September 4th, 2018, and is still talked about as the moment Destiny 2 finally became great. What it didn't do was hit Activision's number. On the November 8th earnings call, COO Cody Johnson told investors the core audience hadn't fully come back, citing underperformance against our expectations and describing the fix: ship content faster, add more ways to monetize. Luke Smith answered in public the same day, tweeting, "We are not disappointed with Forsaken. A studio and its publisher were now openly disagreeing about the same game, and the disagreement was the entire relationship in miniature." Activision had signed up for a Call of Duty shaped series, sequels on a cadence, and Bungie wanted one world it could tend for a decade. Bungie had also been quietly arranging its exit. In June 2018, 3 months before Forsaken shipped, it took a roughly $100 million investment from Chinese publisher NetEase, money explicitly aimed at building new worlds outside the publishing deal. So, when the announcement came on January 10th, 2019, Bungie and Activision separating 8 years into a 10-year contract, with Bungie keeping the Destiny IP outright, the industry was stunned, but the building was not. According to Kotaku's Jason Schreier, employees celebrated with champagne. Activision told investors the split was mutual and amicable. Wall Street analysts read it as a publisher cutting loose an underperformer. And inside of Bungie, it read very differently. The sequel model had just lost, and the single evolving world dream was finally unsupervised. One detail nobody toasted, though, was those Activision support studios that helped carry Forsaken left with Activision, and the next year, Bungie had to find out what Destiny looks like built with half the hands. The first thing Bungie did with its freedom was confess. In August 2019, Luke Smith published a 3-part essay series called The Director's Cut, one of the strangest documents a AAA studio has ever released. A game director walking players through its own misjudgments in public at length. He wrote about the brutal cost of making Forsaken, about grind-tuned to punishing, about a studio still learning what kind of game it was running. Buried inside was the phrase that would define everything after: Destiny 2 as an evolving world. A single place that moves forward instead of a product line that gets replaced every year. And read closely, the essays already flagged the bill coming due. The game's ballooning file size and aging content were straining Bungie's ability to update it all. Just remember that. The visible version of the plan arrived October 1st, 2019. Shadowkeep launched alongside New Light, a free-to-play version of Destiny 2, and the whole game moved from Blizzard's Battle.net to Steam, with cross-save having arrived weeks later. Strip away the branding, and this was Bungie rebuilding its business model in a single day. There was no publisher involved, no inherent storefront revenue now flowing from optional expansions, season passes, and Eververse instead of box sequels. The free version pulled a huge new audience through Steam's front door, which was the point. An evolving world only works if the doors open. Shadowkeep itself was deliberately modest, a return to the moon assembled heavily from existing pieces. And Bungie was upfront that it was scoped leaner, because it had to be. The split didn't just remove Activision's oversight, it removed High Moon and Vicarious Visions, the external teams that had been quietly producing a large share of Destiny content since 2017. Bungie now had to feed a live service calendar that used to be supplied by multiple studios, using only itself, while simultaneously spinning up the incubation projects Independence was supposed to make possible. The year's 4 seasons of mostly temporary disposable activities were the compromise, content cheap enough to sustain, and just enough so that players would still play throughout the year and not just join and leave after a major expansion releases. But players noticed how thin the seasonal content was. Inside the studio, that thinness was simply the output of one company. Then the model produced its proof of concept. Across 2020, Bungie started doing things a box sequel could never do. A one-time limited event where thousands of players stood in the tower and watched the Almighty get shot out of the sky in real time. And they were also able to do a season-long Darkness Arrival that crept across destinations week by week. This was story happening to the game rather than shipping in a new box. In June 2020, Bungie made it official policy, announcing 3 future expansions: Beyond Light, The Witch Queen, and Lightfall, all inside of Destiny 2. There would be no Destiny 3. The sequel era was completely over, which exposed a problem. Destiny 2 was an engine and codebase designed to be replaced after a couple of years. Now, sentenced to live forever, with an install size swelling well past 100 gigabytes, Bungie's solution was something no major live game had tried: deleting itself. In October 2020, Mark Noseworthy gave Edge magazine the most honest description of Bungie's problem anyone had offered. "We sometimes think of Destiny like running Disneyland, a theme park that never closes. You can't shut it down for 2 years to build the next one. You renovate with the guests inside." It was meant as a mission statement, and it was also a confession because by 2020, the park was physically collapsing under its own weight. Destiny 2's install size had swollen past 120 gigabytes on a launch PS4. Every patch took longer to build and certify, and the codebase was choking on 3 years of accumulated content. So, in June 2020, Bungie announced the Destiny Content Vault, the politest possible name for what it was. The game would delete large parts of itself. That November, 4 entire destinations vanished: Mars, Io, Titan, and Mercury, alongside the Leviathan raid and the campaigns players had bought in 2017 and 2018, the Red War, Curse of Osiris, and Warmind. The install size dropped by roughly half. However, this is the most interesting part. The Red War wasn't removed because it was bad. It was removed because, like I said earlier, Destiny 2 was never engineered to be a forever game. It was built as a sequel, a product Activision's model assumed would be replaced in a couple years, and the engine simply couldn't carry a permanent, ever-growing world. The evolving world had to burn its own launch content to stay alive. Hold that thought, because it never stops being true for this game. The year's production reality made everything much harder for Bungie. They went fully remote in March 2020, and a studio whose pipeline depended on shared labs and physical console kits had to reinvent how it shipped anything at all. Beyond Light slipped by 7 weeks, from September 22nd to November 10th, with Bungie citing the pandemic directly. And when it arrived, it was a way for Bungie to test the new formula. Stasis, the first Darkness subclass, was new ground. The returning Cosmodrome was the Vault running in reverse. Old Destiny 1 content recycled as fresh real estate, with the Vault of Glass raid following the same path in 2021. And the players split exactly the way you would expect. New light arrivals got a leaner, more comprehensible game, and veterans watched places that they had lived in for 3 years disappear and concluded because they were paying for a game that was actively deleting itself. Bungie absorbed all the anger because the alternative was a game that could no longer ship updates at all. The same year produced a second, faster lesson in what players would tolerate: sunsetting. A system that capped the power of older weapons to force gear turnover, landed with Beyond Light, and died within months. Joe Blackburn, who had just taken over as game director, killed it in February 2021 and told players their gear would stay usable. The Forever game was discovering its real rules through public pain. Strip the year down, and the trade was this: Bungie sacrificed its own past, a chunk of its players' trust, and a winter of goodwill to keep the single world model technically alive. What it needed next was an expansion good enough to make the surgery look worth it, and it built one, right as buyers with very deep pockets started paying attention. The Witch Queen was supposed to ship in late 2021. Bungie pushed it to February of 2022, said openly the delay was about quality, and bridged the gap that December with the 30th anniversary pack. This included Galhorn's return and a dungeon built as a love letter to the original loot cave from D1. And it's worth sitting with how far that is from where the studio had been. 3 years earlier, Bungie couldn't fill a content gap to save its life. At one point, almost literally. Now, it could whip one up that players adored and still hold the main event back for polish. What that extra time bought is the real story, because the Witch Queen is where the independent post-Activision pipeline finally fired on every cylinder. The campaign was built on one rule: that every mission should feel like its own episode of television rather than a chopped up movie, with each one designed around a distinct mechanic, the way a memorable dungeon is. And then the price tag showed up. On January of 2022, 3 weeks before launch, Sony announced it was buying Bungie for $3.6 billion. That January was the peak of an industry-wide buying frenzy. Take-Two had just agreed to swallow Zynga for nearly $13 billion, and 13 days before the Bungie news, Microsoft revealed its $69 billion deal for Activision Blizzard. Since interest rates were still pinned near zero and live service games were the asset everybody suddenly wanted to own, it was a no-brainer for Sony at the time. It also closed a gap in Sony's studio portfolio. It was a studio that actually knew how to run a games as a service for over a decade now, and you could read that priority straight off the deal. Somewhere around $1.2 billion, roughly a third of the price, was earmarked purely to keep employees from leaving. Sony was buying the people who knew how to keep Destiny running. Internally and publicly, Bungie sold the whole thing on independence, and once the ink dried, the studio got candid in a way it had never been. In March 2022, Justin Truman, a senior leader who'd eventually run the entire company, told Axios flat out that Destiny 3 was never happening. The single game vision, he said, had always been the plan, and defending it had been nearly impossible until Bungie won its creative freedom. So, Bungie, flush with Sony's money and a pile of retention bonuses, grew faster than it had ever had, past 1,000 employees and barreling towards 1,200, staffing not only Destiny, but the Marathon Revival and a slate of incubation projects. The multi-franchise studio Pete Parsons had spent years promising. All of it rested on one assumption: that Destiny 2's revenue would keep climbing the way the Witch Queen made it look like it could. The next expansion put that assumption to the test, and the answer came back no, in the most expensive way it possibly could have. On paper, Lightfall's launch on February of 2023 was the biggest moment in franchise history. Over 300,000 concurrent players on Steam, which was an all-time record that still stands today. Inside of a week, the same chart told the real story. The campaign asked players to chase a MacGuffin called the Veil that the game never really explained, and it was set in a neon city that didn't really match the apocalypse arriving overhead. Former developers later claimed an earlier version of the campaign had been substantially cut and rebuilt before release. Whatever the cause, What shipped kind of felt like filler, priced as the prelude to a finale, and players responded the way the business could least afford. They completely left. Here's why that mattered more than a bad review cycle. Bungie's post-Activision model is retention. Expansion, season passes, and Eververse. Every revenue stream assumes the player stays. By mid-October 2023, Bloomberg's Jason Schreier reported leadership told staff that revenue was running 45% below projections for the year. 2 weeks later, on October 30th, Bungie laid off roughly 100 people, which was about 8% of the studio, some of whom learned their fate from a 15-minute meeting that appeared on their calendars that morning. Among them was Michael Salvatore, the composer whose music defined Destiny and Halo before it for over 2 decades. The decision came from Bungie's leadership and not Sony, but Sony was suddenly very relevant because of fine print that no one had really noticed. The acquisition agreement, per IGN's reporting, tied Bungie's prized independence to financial performance. If they missed the targets badly enough, Sony could dissolve the board and fold the studio into PlayStation outright. The final shape, the saga's conclusion, was testing internally as good but not great, and good was not going to save the company. Leadership delayed it from February 27th to June 4th, 2024, which bought 4 months of polish time. A delay Bloomberg reported first, and one that reportedly also moved the launch out of Sony's fiscal year. Marathon had slipped to 2025, and by February 2024, game director Joe Blackburn, the public face of the recovery, announced he would leave once the final shape shipped. What turned the year around cost players nothing. In April 2024, Bungie shipped Into the Light, a free update built around Onslaught, which was the horde mode the community had requested for years, plus a vault of beloved returning weapons with no paywall attached. It may have seemed like damage control, but it totally worked. Sentiment that had been the lowest in the game's history, so far anyways, swung upward weeks before the final shape went on sale. So, the final shape arrived carrying a load no expansion had ever carried. Finish a 10-year story, justify a $3.6 billion acquisition, keep Sony from taking over the studio, and prove the Forever game had a future. It delivered more of that than anyone expected, and 57 days later, Bungie's best year, and subsequently its worst year, turned out to be the exact same year. The final shape launched on June 4th, 2024 into a wall of error codes. And once the servers steadied, the final shape quickly became one of the best expansions outside of Forsaken in Destiny 2's history. Steam peaked at, again, over 300,000 concurrent players, which was a hair under Lightfall's record, and reviews opened at 93 on Metacritic, which was the highest in franchise history. After 7 years, Destiny 2 had its masterpiece. 57 days later, on July 31st, Bungie laid off 220 people, 17% of the studio, folded another 155 roles into Sony, and spun one incubation project out into a new PlayStation studio. CEO Pete Parsons published a blog admitting the company had grown too ambitious and began running in the red. The grief turned into rage when fans surfaced public records showing Parsons had spent a reported $2.4 million on classic cars since the Sony deal, with purchases continuing right into the window of the cuts. Developers were confirming their teams were gone while critics were still praising their game. Then the reporting explained the part that made no sense. Stephen Totillo's game file revealed that layoffs had been planned before the final shape had even shipped. The sales outcome was never going to change them. One former employee needed 7 words, and yet it sold less than Lightfall. The best reviewed Destiny content ever made was outsold at launch by the worst reviewed expansion in the game's history, because in a live game, endings don't sell. Lapsed players come back for a fresh start, not for the end of the story they stopped following 2 years ago. Bloomberg's Jason Schreier filled in the rest. Payback, a secret third-person Destiny spin-off, had been quietly canceled that June, and its team folded into Marathon. Destiny 3 was not in development and never had been. Luke Smith, the man who rebooted Destiny 2, led the Forsaken rescue, and wrote the Evolving World Doctrine, was gone, along with Mark Noseworthy, the other half of that original leadership. Bungie had even debated rebranding Destiny 2 outright. The studio had finished its story and found the trap underneath, a forever game whose forever had just ended, with no sequel to hand the audience to. By its own decree, 6 years running. The stopgap after the final shape was episodes. 3 larger seasonal arcs, Echoes, Revenant, and Heresy, pitched as the evolution of the seasonal model. However, players saw seasons with a new label, and the experiment lasted exactly 1 year. The real answer arrived under the codename Frontiers, which was teased in late 2024 and detailed in a May 2025 showcase. Annual expansions were now gone, and they were replaced by 2 medium releases a year, a new saga about the Nine called Fate, and a rebuilt structure for the whole game under the new director Tyson Green. Stripped of the marketing, the pitch was radical reinvention. Convince an exhausted player base that their finished game was a fresh start. It had a name, The Edge of Fate, and it came closer to killing Destiny 2 than Curse of Osiris ever did. The Edge of Fate arrived July 15th of 2025 and changed almost everything about the game. The director the map screen for the game had used since 2017 was replaced by the Portal, a menu of curated playlists. Power was reset and rebuilt around a 5-tier gear climb. The new destination, Kepler, removed sparrows in favor of gimmick traversal powers called Matter Spark, and if you've played this expansion, you know how awful Matter Spark is. And because of the SAG-AFTRA strikes, long-running characters returned mid-saga with new voices or not at all. However, the verdict of this expansion was very immediate. A day 1 launch peak just over 99,000 on Steam, roughly a third of Lightfall or the final shape, and the lowest of any expansion since the game came to Steam, with the expansion's Steam rating sinking below 50% within days. By October, Steam was logging record low player counts, and community population trackers showed the total player base falling beneath Curse of Osiris lows. The era Bungie itself once measured as 5 weeks away from shutdown had been undercut by its own reinvention. The corporate reckoning was just as fast. On August 21st, Pete Parsons retired after 9 years as CEO of Bungie and more than 2 decades at the company. Justin Truman took over as studio head, a title notable for what it wasn't, because there would be no Bungie CEO at all. Sony's CFO publicly signaled the studio's famed independence was wearing thin, and in November, Sony booked an impairment of roughly $204 million against Bungie, stating that Destiny 2's sales and engagement had missed expectations. By the 2026 May results, the fiscal year's total write-down would reach $765 million. Then, on November 14th, Bungie did something studios almost never do. It published a post calling its own redesign the wrong path for Destiny, and began rolling the resets back. Game director Tyson Green was blunt in interviews. It simply just didn't work. In December, Renegades was released on December 2nd, and it was a licensed Star Wars crossover with a lightsaber-shaped Praxic blade, blasters, and a new dungeon arriving mid-month, and it landed better, pulling in around 70,000 concurrent players on Steam. Marathon finally launched on March 5th of 2026, and it absolutely did not reach even the closest of heights that Destiny 2 had reached. Bungie now ran 2 live service games, and neither had the population to carry the company. According to reporting from Bloomberg and Forbes, leadership decided in early 2026 to end Destiny 2's development, while teams kept building the next expansion, Shattered Cycle, unaware. Almost nobody inside knew until May 21st, when a post titled Destiny 2, Every End is a New Beginning announced one final update and canceled Shattered Cycle, The Alchemist, and the Shadow of Order patch outright. The game stays online indefinitely like D1 did, while Bungie shifts to Marathon and prepares, in its own words, to begin and work incubating our next games. Jason Schreier reported just a couple days after this, Destiny 3 was never greenlit, noting that nothing in the Destiny universe currently is. A popular sequel would cost roughly upwards of $500 million, and more layoffs are expected. And with that arrives the final update in Destiny 2's life, Monument of Triumph. The patch notes for this patch ran roughly 29,000 words by Bungie's own count. And more than 160,000 players showed up on Steam on day one. More than double what Renegades drew at launch, and also double what Marathon had ever achieved at its peak all time. Honestly, at this point, I don't know what's going to convince Sony to backpedal on them deciding not to go with Destiny 3, but the numbers certainly don't make sense to me. Because after 9 years and every disaster in this story, it all traces back to one mismatch. Destiny 2 was designed as a chapter, and it was forced to be an entire library. Activision's sequel vision died in 2019, and Bungie's Forever World vision died in 2026. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.